Well, let's just pick up a couple threads here. Let's talk about bicycle lanes because one of our senior fellows at Frontier talks about this regularly as the absurdity of bicycle lanes. His observation would be that bicycle lanes are infrequently used. I mean, there's some places where it may make sense, but often they're really about pushing out the automobile. Most people really can't use a bicycle to get to work. In fact, it's amazing how many of these bicycle lanes are almost like permanently encroaching on car lanes. What's your take on these bicycle lanes? And is anyone using them?
Yeah, there are some bicycle lanes in Toronto that have been in place for 10, 15, 20 years that, at least in the warm months in spring, summer, and fall, do have a degree of ridership. And generally, those are on non-arterial roads. And
Hmm.
they're more sort of in the downtown or in neighborhoods where it really makes sense that someone would commute or, go to a store or whatnot on an A to Z path. And those have been sort of found, and nobody complains about those lanes. The
Hmm.
idea of putting bike lanes on major roads, taking out a car lane and putting a bike lane, to think there'll be a critical mass of people who will commute a very long distance in 4 seasons is just not reality. So the two major streets in Toronto, in terms of looking at the map, are Yonge Street, which goes north and south, and Bloor Street, it's called Danforth on the other side, which goes east and west. And that's really like the XY axis of Toronto. So the two
Hmm.
major streets, and my apologies to everyone in the rest of Canada, but perhaps the two most major city streets in this country, they had multiple lanes on them in the past. Now those streets have pretty much moved to being single lane roads in each direction, because then there are
Hmm.
bike lanes on either side, bike lanes that generally aren't used all that much. And David, when you look to my point about other cities in the world, I can't think of an example of a major city that their key roads are only one lane. Bike lane or not,
Crazy.
it's one lane for a car lane. Now people say, oh, in Manhattan they've got bike lanes in all these places. Sure, but you look at Avenue of the Americas and it's like 5 lanes in each
Hmm.
direction, and there's a
Exactly. Yeah.
bike lane sort of spaced off to the side, and they found
Hmm.
a way to make it work through their spacing. Here we haven't been able to do it. And there are a lot of examples and viral videos of ambulances and fire trucks that can't get by, because
Hmm.
one very aggressive thing that bike lane lobby groups push for is for the lanes not just to be painted, but in Toronto, we put in concrete dividers to
Yes.
separate the bike lane from the vehicle lane, which means in an emergency situation or in any situation when you go, well, I just need to sort of momentarily go into the bike lane to get around, you can't. And that rigidity has caused a lot of frustration. I would, without a doubt, take out those concrete dividers, as mayor or someone in municipal
Hmm.
government, because you just need to do it to let the city get around. And David, you're so right that it's a passion point for so many. When I would go around and give my campaign speeches and I talk about all the things that we got to do to make the city better, and low taxes and
Hmm.
dealing with the drug crisis, more police presence, and people will applaud and cheer for different one of those
Hmm.
lines. And you say the bike lane thing, and the applause and the cheering is loudest.
Is
David,
that right?
I gave comments at the Canada Strong and Free conference
Hmm.
in 2024, and it was a great experience being there. And I wasn't just talking to Torontonians, but people all across Canada. And I mentioned the bike lane thing, and that got the loudest cheer in the room too.
Is
And this was people
interesting.
all across the country. So a group of conservatives gathering to talk about every
Yeah.
issue under the sun, and that's the issue. To our point
Right.
about all politics being local, that gets people most animated.
Well, that's fascinating, Anthony, because it kind of makes sense that, I mean, think of the absurdity. They're putting in these bike lanes everywhere, right? And they're putting them in so they're permanent with these kind of walled concrete dividers.
So,
And you're putting them in many communities where the season to use them, like in Winnipeg, you can see these introduction of bicycle lanes, and you could use them maybe for a few months.
yeah.
And this is just right across it, like Calgary, Saskatoon, everywhere. They're popping up, and it is so absurd because people are figuring out. I think at the citizens level, they're realizing that this is not practical. It's like
Yeah.
delusional public policy being set by a class of politicians and special interest groups and so-called experts, urban planners, that are going overboard with this. It's like they don't live in our own communities. Am I being unfair to this this class of the good and the great who are kind of boxing us all in, including in bicycle lanes and not opening up land so we have places to live?
No, I think you're right. And I really would encourage these bike lobby activists to think about all of society. It is a very selfish thing to say, I need this lane just for me. People bill me sometimes on, in the media and social media, say, oh, he's the anti-bike guy. I go, well, hold on a second. I bike around. David, I use some of those bike lanes with my kids and the
Yeah,
Danforth
bikes are
bike lane.
great.
I go on the Danforth bike lane, but here's the thing, only one when I'm on it. And isn't it a privilege for me to have a private bike lane for myself? I guess, but I need a reality check, and I
Mhm.
have the reality check. I acknowledge that I shouldn't have this private lane because I live in a society with other people who have other needs. So it's not all about me and catering to
Mhm.
my whims. And to be clear, I just bike, occasionally on these bike lanes. It's not
Mhm.
like I'm doing it every day, but I find it bizarre that when I go on these lanes,
Mhm.
I'm the only one. And I
Okay.
also should say that talking about my carefree youth in Toronto, as a teenager, I biked all across the city when these bike lanes didn't exist. And yeah, you have to have
Indeed.
some street smarts and be mindful of, if you're going a sidewalk for a minute, you have to be super mindful of pedestrians. When you're on the road, you have to be mindful and looking around for traffic. But yeah, that's what you have to do. It's that simple.
So I like the way you're thinking. I'd almost be tempted to vote for you, Anthony. So the question is this: aren't we missing the forest through the trees here in the sense that cities are not just simply places to live? They're also important labor markets. It's where employees come to get a job and employers go to find employees. And if you make it so difficult, if you make your commuting time every day, and I see this in a number of major cities, whether it's Vancouver or right across the country, and if it takes 3 or 4 hours to get anywhere, why would you live in that city? I mean, if you can't get down the Gardiner Expressway because it's down to 2 lanes, I mean, you're hooped. I mean, you really are living a very impoverished life, even though you could be getting a decent wage. If you're spending 3, 4, 5 hours every day on the road, you've got a very low quality of life. And it's almost like the urban planners today, the politicians, don't get this basic reality and their duty to enable cities to work.
Well, traffic is a moral issue, David. I think you put that
Indeed.
so well about people's daily lives. When you have a person who wants to get home to see their family and they're involved in civic life, they coach the baseball
Mm,
team and they're stressed about getting back there because you've added 20, 30 minutes to their commute, that's a problem. All of those things. And I'm really glad you talk about local economy generation, because one thing that always surprises me is that in municipal politics they don't often talk about the economy during
mm,
elections, during campaigns. It's
yeah.
kind of bizarre. During
Hmm.
federal races and provincial races, people really like, sometimes the slogan is just, it's all about the economy. I'm going to be the economy minded, and the famous James
Exactly.
Carville line, it's the economy, stupid, that famous
Hmm.
line. But in municipal politics, candidates, and I found this during my last the election I participated in, I was the only person who talked about the local economy. And yet, when we look at the statistics of most Canadians living in cities, and of course Toronto is very populous, if the Toronto economy is not doing well, Canada is not doing well. So goes Toronto, so goes the nation. So if we
Hmm.
are not providing a city that is conducive to investment, jobs, growth, trade, watch out. That's how you get that downward spiral. That's how you go in the direction Detroit went a couple decades ago.
No, I think you're absolutely right. So strategically, then cities are incredibly important. They're foundational to the health and the economic vibrancy, the prosperity of our nation. If the, as you say, the cities aren't working, then our country is not going to be working. And in this context, we really have almost a perfect storm, don't we, in terms of special interests taking control of, quote, City Hall. We've got a lot of interest groups that are doing the bidding of almost dysfunctional provincial and federal policy. I mean, I think case in point, if we think of, as you've alluded to, the massive increases of crime on city streets, there's very real reasons for this as we look at kind of a a turnstile design of justice where people just are let out all the time to reoffend. We've got this whole called, and I think you've written about this, Anthony, the so-called um, safe supply of hard drugs on our streets. BC is a primary poster child for this dysfunctional policy. So we have a lot of governments at the provincial federal level that don't understand local government. Is that what's going on here as well?
I think so. You know, David, earlier you said the phrase, "What is a city?" And I kind of panicked for a second. Oh man, that's a profound question. I don't know if I'm going to be answer to it. And I thank
Hmm.
you for you kind of pivoted away and you didn't put me on the spot. But I guess
Okay.
what that does remind me of is when you go back to ancient Greek philosophy, which is the first ever political philosophy. You know,
Mhm,
Aristotle says there's the polis, which is just like a few families hanging out together and making things
mhm,
work. And then there's the city state. There's ancient Athens and I guess
mhm,
Sparta, not that they got along. And that was kind of it. Like there weren't really countries, there weren't really provinces. That stuff kind of
mhm,
came later. And when people thought about what is politics, they were thinking about cities. They were thinking
mhm,
about, you know, Athens and how we govern
mhm,
through a city state. And we have in politics all across the Western world, we kind of think of municipal politics as like if you're someone interested in politics and a career in it, that's like your training wheels, and then maybe you go on and you be an
mhm,
MPP or an MLA, and then federal government is the main thing. It's where the action is at, because you know the
mhm.
prime minister's on everyone's television all across the country, not just in one province or city. But and look, I get it. But I also encourage people to think the other way around about the great honor it is to be a city councilor, to be the mayor of your community, because that's where the action's at, and that's what the origins of politics are, and that's what our daily lives are, as we've said. So to
Mhm.
really get in the game on the municipal level, that's not the training wheels. That's the meat and potatoes of politics.
I totally agree. So I think in many ways, the point that you're making, Anthony, is that the foundation for citizenship in this country is our local community. And
Yes.
therefore, the onus is on everyone, particularly the far removed ethereal levels of the provincial federal governments who operate at the 300,000 foot level to engage with municipalities and to empower them and not disempower them. Because this is the foundation at the local level of citizenship. And this is where we all live together. This is where we work together on a day to day basis. And this is where we can also be empowered to speak up and find our voice and be able to make a difference. And that is a truly positive Canadian story that I think is just not really on the radar of provincial federal governments. And it's really quite disturbing because this is really ruining the quality of life of every Canadian, I think.
No, it absolutely is. Well said. And the good news, because maybe I'm naive, but I am an optimist. I see that the winds of change are coming, and
Mm,
people acknowledge that the status quo isn't working. They see these cycles happening. I think we
mhm,
see that there's winds of change on the federal level in Canada, and that means on the individual level, sure, Justin Trudeau out, Pierre Poilievre in, but I think it also means that people are shifting their thinking in general and what
mhm,
possibilities we have. And because we know there are wild divergences in swing voters, you know, you go from Rachel Notley to Jason Kenney and Danielle Smith. I mean, that tells you, and you know, you go from Justin Trudeau to Pierre Poilievre. That tells you that there's millions of people in this country who they're not rigid ideologues or partisans. They're just
mhm,
regular, decent people
mhm,
who you know are watching the elections a few days before the vote and taking things very honestly and earnestly. And they are kind of the feedback mechanism for how's daily life really going and what do they want to take a chance at. And I think those people are the ones who are saying, I'm not so crazy about what's going on right now. All these tax
mhm,
increases and we can't get around. And I don't think it's normal for drugs on the street. And maybe they were initially open to some of these
mhm,
ideas. They say, oh, okay, I get the idea. You're gonna give them these free drugs, and that's gonna like help them out by not making them connected to the dealers as
mhm.
much. Okay, we'll try it out, and then they see it's not working, and they want to go
Exactly.
in the other direction. And I think those regular decent people are. coming around, and the pendulum is really swinging. So it's a
Okay.
great opportunity, David. I think for us to bring about that positive change we need to do here.
I think you're right. So positive change, and I think this debate is rising right across the country. I think you're right, Anthony. So let's talk about a couple of these challenges. It's almost like there's a lot of federal dysfunctional federal policies that are and provincial ones that are very much impacting our communities. So immigration is an example. No one is against immigration. That's absurd. The issue is how it's managed. Well, we have really, when you add everything up, legal immigrants coming to through the front door, illegal immigrants, as well as people on terms of short-term visas like international students. We are shockingly at about the 2 million level annually coming into this country. I mean, it's unheard of. It's a record high number. How is that impacting our local communities from your perspective, Anthony?
Well, it's impacting things quite negatively in terms of the pressures it's placing on our infrastructure and our ability to serve people's needs.
Hmm.
It's ultimately a supply and demand issue. And if you can get to a point where the volume of people coming in is adequately being met with increases in housing and hospitals
Hmm.
and public transit and roads, then you're fine. And we have made that work for sure in past decades in Canada. But we're at a point right now, this very sort of frustrating nexus where our ability to get things built seems to be worse than ever, and the volume of people coming is
Hmm.
greater than ever. So, you don't have to have a PhD in mathematics to realize that that's a numbers game, and it's just not working out. And the Greater Toronto Area is really affected by that the most. There's a lot of talk about the housing crisis, but I think a lot of the solutions, they're really focusing on the supply side, and it's not that easy to just build whether we want a fourplex or a 50-story tower,
Hmm.
whatever it is. I mean, those things take time, and there's various macroeconomics in there. The one thing we do have a bit more direct control of is the demand. So the volume of people who are seeking
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
space on the subway, or that space on the
Hmm.
highway, or that housing unit. So we have to manage that, absolutely. And I think everybody's aware of that conversation now, and ready to have it. Neighborhoods in the GTA. Brampton it's a separate city just outside of Toronto. They have a lot of immigration coming to them. They are supposed to have a second hospital, and they've supposed to have had that for many
Hmm.
years, and they're
Hmm.
not being well served. So people, in that neighborhood and they are people more likely to have come from another country more recently.
Hmm.
A lot of them are saying, "Hold on a second, like the numbers game isn't working for us." And we do have, and I know I haven't spoken about this yet, David, but we have the tragic exodus of people leaving Toronto, not just those, as I said, young people who don't see a future here, but immigrants who come here and then like 5 or 7 years later, they're like, what? This isn't what I thought I was getting in Canada.
Yeah.
I'm
Yeah.
gone. I'm out
Hmm.
of here. I mean, that never used to
Exactly.
happen, David. People would stay
Yeah.
for decades for their life.
Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.